Ancient Egypt lasted over 3,000 years, making it one of the longest-lasting empires in history. Most people think of ancient Egypt as the land of pyramids and mummies. However, this civilization did much more than create artifacts that still fascinate us today. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians were like us. They had similar hopes and dreams and fought the same fears and illnesses. And yet, partly because they survived for so long, the ancient Egyptians also changed the course of world history. They worshipped hundreds of gods. They built pyramids and fortresses that still stand as monuments. They made cultural developments, scientific discoveries, and political events that still influence our lives today. Without ancient Egypt, our lives would be very different. Here are 6 ways that ancient Egypt changed world history forever. Number 1. Ancient Egypt was one of the first nation-states in history. King Narmer first united Egypt around 3150 BCE. For reference, the Babylonian Empire didn't start until around 1894 BCE, over 1,000 years later. Before unification, several different tribes lived in the land around the Nile, and they depended on the Nile for survival. Their proximity to each other allowed a great civilization to spring up in the North African desert, especially as climate change pushed the different tribes closer together in the river valley. The first people in the Nile River Valley came around 5000 BCE, and people gradually transitioned from a nomadic to a more pastoral lifestyle. Because of the natural abundance in the area, people began to seek personal improvement. The tribal leaders developed into a ruling class, and the tribes grew. As the ruling class acquired more wealth, they started paying for artisans and craftspeople. The people around the Nile settled into an agricultural way of life and developed a complex society with little evidence of outside influence. The people in the river valley continued to consolidate. Around 3600 BCE, there was a sudden increase in the population, which led to a rise in food production and urbanization. There were 3 main kingdoms at this time, and they were centered around Jenny, Nupt, and Nekhen. The 3 kingdoms competed with each other for resources and precious metals like gold and jewels. Jenny was the first prominent kingdom, and they eventually conquered the other 2 and united all of Egypt under the rule of King Narmer. Ancient Egypt was now a united kingdom with a complex social and political structure. Of course, other civilizations had developed this kind of complexity, but the ancient Egyptians were unique because they took their development a step further. When King Narmer united all of Egypt under his rule, he also created the first nation-state. Ancient Egypt was more than just a kingdom. It was a nation with its own identity. The ancient Egyptians shared values and cultural practices that gave them a common identity that separated them from the tribes around them. This was the first time national identity had occurred in world history, and it changed the course of the world. Number 2. The Egyptians created one of the first written languages in the world. Developing a national identity included creating a written language, even though much of the population was illiterate. Only high officials could read, and the pharaoh usually kept them close to minimize any threat to the throne. Writing allowed the Egyptian kingdom to grow powerful and develop an identity around the pharaoh's strength. Despite the high illiteracy rate, the ancient Egyptians wrote their hieroglyphics across the kingdom. Their inscriptions included names and titles to enforce the social hierarchy, and the hieroglyphics also helped them in their record-keeping. Hieroglyphs were one of the first written languages in the world, and it certainly influenced the world, as Egypt became a cultural center whose influence reached across the North African coast, the Mediterranean Sea, and even into the Near East. Writing allowed the Egyptians to prosper, so some scribes became wealthy and powerful. Almost everyone needed a scribe service, but successful scribes could rise above village life to become a vizier, who was a judge on behalf of the pharaoh. Becoming a judge might not seem like a powerful reason to learn to read and write, but the vizier was the second most powerful man in Egypt. He was the pharaoh's personal assistant, state secretary, and head of justice. Of course, not every scribe became a vizier. Many of them lived comfortable lives in villages and would teach some of the local children to read and write. Boys were usually the only ones who were educated, although some scribes would teach their daughters. Women could not perform administrative duties like scribal work, so boys were the only children accepted into temple or palace schools. Their education began at 5 years old, just like our education system does today, but children had to choose their careers by the time they were 9 years old. Hieroglyphics didn't only change the way that the Egyptians communicated and educated their children, it also led to several world-changing innovations. Centuries before the Chinese people invented paper, the Egyptians invented papyrus. It grew readily in the Nile Valley, and the people discovered how to process it as a lightweight writing surface. The ancient Egyptians also created the fundamental calendar structure that shapes our calendar today. Creating one of the first written languages in the world allowed the Egyptians to grow and innovate in ways that changed our lives today. Number 3. Ancient Egyptians carved out a society built on the divine nature of the pharaohs. One of the reasons that ancient Egyptian civilization survived for so long is that the people believed in divine kingship. The pharaoh was both the high priest and the political leader of the government. He led the army, signed peace treaties, and served as an intermediary between the gods and the people. These jobs also meant that the pharaoh was responsible for keeping the gods happy, which could be a difficult position during war or disaster. The idea of a divine leader started early in the Old Kingdom period. It helped the kings maintain some order, especially because the Egyptians believed divine monarchy was the only form of government worth having. Many parts of life, including art, architecture, and writing, centered around this idea. Although the pharaoh had immense power in ancient Egypt, it was not uncommon for power shifts to arise as other influential leaders seized the throne. These could be priests, members of the nobility, or influential people in the government. The pharaoh wasn't always the wealthiest member of the elite, so even though he was supposed to be divine, he was not immune to power struggles for the throne. Number 4. Ancient Egyptians conquered many tribes around them, changing African and Mediterranean history forever. Like other powerful civilizations, ancient Egyptians conquered lands around them. Over time, their direct rule extended south past Kush and north through Syria, but other areas like Punt were under Egyptian influence. The Middle Kingdom was the start of the Egyptian military expansion. During this time, the Egyptians conquered some of Nubia, which had a substantial gold mine trade, and built 17 fortresses to control the trade in that region. Egypt also developed a standing army in the Middle Kingdom, with the system being improved during the New Kingdom. Before, the pharaoh had to call up an army, often relying upon governors to help fill the ranks. These leaders had to train healthy soldiers to be ready to help the pharaoh. Still, because the army was decentralized, the pharaoh had to maintain good relations with these local leaders. It made the governors more powerful, which occasionally caused tension. Anyone could join the permanent standing army, and training began at 5 years old. This new army forever changed ancient Egypt. One of the pharaohs who made substantial use of it was Thutmose III, who lived from about 1481 to 1425 BCE. He spent much of his childhood training with the army, becoming a skilled military leader dedicated to expanding the ancient Egyptian empire. His army was powerful and helped garner other riches, territory, and trade routes for the empire. The New Kingdom pharaohs were focused on expansion, and everyone sought new land to conquer. The result was that a significant portion of the Near East became part of the Egyptian empire, influencing world history. Number 5. The ancient Egyptians built pyramids that continue to inspire. The Egyptians focused on the afterlife. Many rituals centered on maintaining good standing after dying. Some of the most well-known ancient Egyptian monuments today are their tombs and pyramids. But later pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings, a collection of royal tombs that have almost all been robbed. Most of the graves are either empty, incomplete, or both. However, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom didn't have regular tombs. They built pyramids as their final resting places. Historians believe the pyramid also had religious connections by being closely related to the sun god. The shape resembles the sun's rays, and the slope would allow the pharaoh to join the ancestors after death. Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza, but there were several pyramid complexes across ancient Egypt. It was a way for the pharaohs to display their power and wealth. But the pyramids were also easy targets for grave robbers looking for riches. The pharaohs justified this excessive use of resources because the Egyptians believed the pharaohs were divine rulers. Still, as the Egyptians began to develop other influential political leaders, the practice of building pyramids gradually faded. Today, the pyramids of Egypt are still major tourist attractions, and the Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It is the only ancient wonder left standing. The ancient Egyptians meant for the pyramids to be a reminder of their wealth and power, and the pyramids have certainly kept people interested in a culture that started thousands of years ago. Number 6. King Tut's tomb accidentally helped fuel modern Egyptomania. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 has been a modern source of interest in ancient Egypt. Howard Carter and his team discovered the tomb had been undisturbed, which was rare for Egyptian pyramids and burial places. Ancient Egyptian rulers were buried with everything they might need in the afterlife, which included riches. As a result, tomb raiders frequently targeted their tombs. These raids often happened centuries before archaeologists arrived, so finding an intact tomb was always a significant discovery. Of course, King Tutankhamun did not intend to interest scholars, students, and tourists with his final resting place. He was a ruler during the New Kingdom and came to the throne at 8 or 9 years old. Even though he married Akhenaten, King Tut had no surviving heirs. He worked to restore the traditional Egyptian religion before dying at 19 years old. At first, some historians thought he had been murdered because of bone fractures to the back of King Tut's skull. But archaeologists have recently proven those fractures occurred after his death. Thus, his cause of death remains a mystery, although most scholars agree he died because of complications from a broken leg. King Tut might not have been influential during his life, but he has become one of the most well-known pharaohs today. The treasures in his tomb have provided valuable insight into ancient Egypt, even if most of those items were created specifically for his burial. King Tut's tomb has also spread misinformation concerning the pharaoh's curse. Many locals believe his tomb was cursed, and the newspapers in the 1920s spread the word around the globe. Archaeologists maintain that there is no curse on King Tut's tomb. Only 2 excavated tombs in ancient Egypt have curses inscribed on them, and neither of those was King Tut's. Nevertheless, curses have become a cornerstone of the popular understanding of ancient Egypt, inspiring people to explore the wonders of the ancient Egyptians left behind along the shores of the Nile. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about ancient Egypt, check out our book, Ancient Egypt, a captivating guide to Egyptian history, ancient pyramids, temples, Egyptian mythology, and pharaohs such as Tutankhamun and Cleopatra. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.